Good morning, everyone. Welcome back after your midterm, which I'm grading, and they're all going well. This is Brad Berzer. This is American Heritage, our first class after the midterm. So we've now started a little late, but I can't help it because of all the plague stuff. But we are now in the very last part of the course. And of course, this class that I'm recording is for Monday, April 6th of 2020, but I'm actually recording this on April 5th of 2020. And yeah, it's kind of cloudy and gloomy right now here in Hillsdale as I record this, but the sun is supposed to come out. It's supposed to be in the 50s today. So really looking forward to that in all kinds of ways. So when I left you on Wednesday of last week, at least that was when our last lecture was, when I left you, we had been talking about Abraham Lincoln and his idea of Reconstruction, that is the post-war, post-Civil War period, being a period of absolute toleration and absolute looseness in the sense of how would we deal with those people who had rebelled against the country, those from the South, whether they were high politicos or men who had signed up to fight for the Confederate Army. And Lincoln had argued through what we call the River Queen Doctrine, but then also, especially in his second inaugural address, that there really should be no punishment for anyone. He just wanted the country to get back to normal. So if you remember, he said quite beautifully at the end of his second inaugural, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in. To bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish and a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." And as he had told Grant and Sherman on the River Queen, that he wanted punishment for no one. Let everybody go home. Let there be punishment for no one. Get these men back to their farms, and they will once again become good citizens. And in a lot of ways, this is exactly what happened in Reconstruction. Only two people at the end of the Civil War were imprisoned. One was Jeff Davis, who was never held for trial, but was put in prison, especially after he made that executive order calling for all of his troops to move into terrorist cells. And then also the person who had been in charge of one of the southern prison camps, who was charged for war crimes, and he also went to prison. But when you think about the fact that roughly over 1 million men in the South were in arms, and that you had an entire population rising up against the U.S. government, the fact that none of them were punished except for those two is really, really quite astounding. We see that this is one of those things that the Americans seem to have a kind of special take on. That is, we tend to be very forgiving at the end of a war, and there seems to be a kind of nice reconciliation. But now what we do have, of course, that changes things dramatically, at least in terms of the Constitution, but from my perspective fulfills it, is we have the 13th and then the 14th Amendments. 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery, and the 14th Amendment, which guarantees citizenship to all people regardless of color or race. So these two amendments fulfill what the founders had really been seeking during the founding, but had not been able to attain. And as we talked about last week on Wednesday, may we never forget the 54th Massachusetts, or the sacrifices that were made by so many black troops during the Civil War. But also, we can't forget the sacrifices made by white troops either, who many were fighting in favor of ending slavery, of getting through the 13th and the 14th Amendments. Think about your fellow students from Hillsdale, who not only were inspired by Leonidas, but were also inspired by Lincoln and inspired by that vision of ending slavery, that scourge of slavery, of that intolerance that existed with something like slavery. So we have to ask then, at the end of all of this war, what is it that the United States really gains or loses? That is, what changes dramatically during the war. And it is impossible, this is one of the things we're going to see throughout the 20th century. It is impossible to have any kind of serious war, any kind of conflict, violent military conflict that we are involved in that does not dramatically alter our domestic situation as well. So foreign policy often has a huge influence, and yeah, it changes who we are as a people. And you can imagine what a civil war will do to a people, right? Great questions that had to be asked, not only throughout the Civil War, but in that period right after, which we call Reconstruction. That is, that idea of reconstructing the Union as it was, with the exception of the 13th and 14th Amendments. What do we do with those southern states? What do we do with those southerners? What do we do with the federal government, which is more powerful? We just had a very powerful presidency with Abraham Lincoln, and yet we had at the same time an extremely powerful Congress as well, especially through her committees. A very powerful Congress during the Civil War. Let's face it, we had a very strong federal government in the American Civil War, but that's not our tradition. So what do we do with that? Or we have the question of, out of the 30 million people in America, North and South, 4 million of those people are black slaves who have now just suddenly been freed. Well, what do you do with a people who has not experienced literacy, who has not had education, who has not experienced freedom, and we throw them into a free market, free labor situation overnight? So how is that going to change things? And there's absolutely no reason in any way to be bigoted or biased about this. It wouldn't matter if they were black or white or green or yellow or purple. It wouldn't matter. If you've got 4 million human beings who have never experienced freedom and suddenly they have freedom, that's going to change things, especially when we're talking about a rather huge percentage of the US population. This is going to change things. So what happens? Think about what the war did. We lost anywhere from 620,000 to 700,000 men during the war. Over 3 million out of 30 million fought during the war. Really, there was just no family in the United States, North or South, who wasn't in some way affected by the Civil War. And think about the survivors. Many who survived did so without limbs. They survived missing arms or legs or both. And now you've got a population of people who are either invalids or quasi-invalids. You have farms and economies throughout much of the country that have been ignored. Imagine how weird it's been for us in the last few weeks without a fully functioning economy during the coronavirus. Imagine if you had 4 years, for example, in parts of the South where you couldn't farm. There was poverty everywhere. Labor was in disarray. Now, what do? We've got inflationary money all over the place. So what do we do with this? How do we fix the economy? How do we let it revive? What do you do with the cases of extreme warfare that we had during the Civil War? For example, Sherman's legacy of total war as he marched through the South and attacked civilians in civilian homes. He didn't usually attack the middle class, but he attacked the upper classes and he attacked plantations. What does that do for us? What about places where there had been martial law in total violation of the U.S. Constitution throughout the whole Civil War? How do we reconcile that at the end of the war? And think about one population that we've hardly talked about at all, but that is going to be influenced and affected by the Civil War as well: the American Indians. What about the Comanche and the Kiowa in Texas? What about the Cheyenne in Colorado, or the Sioux in Minnesota, or the Plains? There were huge shifts in the way that the American Indians were treated as well during the American Civil War. And all those questions come to the forefront now of the American mind and the American idea. What do we do with these things? And let's think about this. What's changed during the war? I just listed a few facts about how many people died. We have invalids and so forth after the war. But what else do we know? We know that the United States has industrialized during the American Civil War. We now have captains of industry in the North, which means we also have a class system in the North at the end of the Civil War. We have other things, some very positive. We have a whole new medical profession that came into existence through the Red Cross and through Clara Barton and other emergency measures during the Civil War. We really have the entire rise of our new medical profession. We had, throughout the Civil War, a very cozy relationship between government and big business. So is that going to continue? What do we do with all of this? And what about the federal police force we created during the Civil War, the Secret Service? Will they continue to exist? Or how about Lincoln had gotten through Congress very high tariffs and an income tax? Are we going to keep those things? So these are all questions that really have to be asked, and it's not going to be easy to answer those. And imagine we've just had 4 years of warfare. It's brutal, it's bloody, but there was always a tragic nobility to all of it. As we talked about last week, as General Chamberlain of Maine said, this was honor answering honor, blood of near blood born on the battlefield, making brothers of us all. So there was a tragic nobility, but at the end of the Civil War, we just have sheer politics. And it's kind of disgusting. We go from doing noble things on the battlefield, even if they led to death, to making compromises and trying to figure out whose back needs to be scratched here and how do we allow for this privilege to continue, but not that privilege. Who gets these? Who doesn't? So there are a lot of questions that are really left up in the air at the end of the American Civil War. And so hence, we enter into our third phase, our final phase of American history. We enter into the ideological phase of American history. In America, we're going to flirt with ideology mostly through progressivism, as we'll see developing here very quickly, somewhat in today's lecture, but especially in the next few lectures. We're going to look at the ideas of progressivism. But at the end of the Civil War, what we find is not quite ideology, but we do find extreme questions of nationalism, and we find extreme efforts towards nationalism, the kind of creation of an American unity, an American nation state that we had never seen before, not only because of the way that the Union Army had come together to defeat the South, but in that defeat of the South, there's a kind of unity that's being proclaimed through violence. But also, think about what Lincoln had said at the Gettysburg Address. Remember how often he had said that what was this for, right? To remind us all, if we go back to page 499 to the Gettysburg Address, 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And then we have, at the very end of the Gettysburg Address, it is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great work remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from this earth. So even if Lincoln is not quite accurate that all kinds of soldiers had given their lives for the birth of the nation, at least as they were dying on the battlefield, they may not have thought that, Lincoln is making it real. And maybe we have no better example of how the United States begins to unify than one simple grammatical change. Prior to the Civil War, we always referred to these United States in the plural. The United States are going to pass a tariff law. The United States are going to invade Mexico. But as soon as the war was over, the change became one that we still use to this day. The United States is going to pass a tariff. The United States is going to pass a welfare act. The United States is going to invade some foreign country, right? So that one change, that plural, the United States being plural to the United States being singular, is really a significant change in our understanding of what the American nation is. And we get out of the American Civil War and think about what the Army looks like. We've just had 2 million Northern men in arms. Most of those men who had fought on the Northern side simply finished their tour of duty on May 23rd, May 24th, if they were in the Eastern armies, during 1865, if they're in the Western armies, a little bit later, but not much later. And all of these guys just go home. But you have a very large officer corps that had developed throughout the American Civil War. And these guys don't leave the army. And many of them want to go out and fight. And who do they have to fight? Well, now that we've defeated the South, the only people who are really left to fight are the American Indians. And of course, we go into a huge conflict with various American Indian tribes between about 1866, right at the end of the Civil War, lasting all the way up until about 1890. And actually, Christmas of 1890 is the last time we have any real conflict with the American Indians. So this whole time period is a period of warfare after the American Civil War, but it's a period of war against the American Indians, and we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. But before we get to all of that, all of these changes, we have to deal with one other issue that is a critical issue for understanding who and what the American people are, and that is what happens to American blacks, what happens to African Americans, to those slaves, to all of those 4 million people who are liberated during the Civil War and at the end with the 13th and then with the 14th Amendments. Yeah, this is a critical question. And don't forget, we're talking about 4 out of 30 million people. So this is a very significant minority population within the United States. Much of it concentrated, most of it concentrated in the American South. And now we have this move towards freedom. And what do we see? So this to me is one of those object lessons, not only as a historian, but as an American, as we think about what happens to American blacks. So remember Lincoln's solution to the question of slavery. It would never be enough that American whites would merely free the slaves. And it would never be quite good if all American slaves rebelled and went violently against their white neighbors, those who had owned them. Because either way, if whites simply gave black people freedom, or if black people butchered whites to get their freedom, there would be always a resentment on one side or the other. And it would be very difficult to have normalized race relations after a situation like that. And Lincoln's solution, which was the solution of the West, that is, of Western civilization, it's the solution that goes all the way back to Leonidas and before that. And that is, when you arm a man, he becomes free. Think about how often we talked about the necessity of bearing arms in the colonial and the revolutionary period. The question does not change for Americans in the 19th century. If anything, it becomes exaggerated. And so we do have people in the American South among the black population who have rebelled. People like Nat Turner, who did lead a very violent uprising against the white slaveholders. And that was one solution. And one thing that we have to say, no matter how violent or brutal that was, Nat Turner, though he was a black man, was always regarded simply as a man. Even though of all the violent consequences that came from that, he took his free will into his own hands, and he paid for it with the cost of his life, but he died a free man. No white in the South would deny that, but they're also fearful of that. And so what happens with Lincoln arming blacks in 1863, specifically through Governor Andrews of Massachusetts and the 54th and the 55th Massachusetts, and then all kinds of black regiments that arise in 1863, 64, and 65, this gives a clear indication to a people that they are responsible for liberating themselves, and they do. And that triumph is a huge triumph. I would argue that there has never been a more effective means of dealing with oppression than what we saw with the 54th and the 55th Massachusetts. Even, and I say this as someone who absolutely loves Martin Luther King Jr., but even in the movement we see with Martin Luther King Jr., it never could have occurred without what we had with the 54th and the 55th Massachusetts. It should have been one of the greatest moments in world history, and frankly, it was, though it wasn't quite remembered in the way that it should have been, and in large part because of how Reconstruction happened. So many whites went back to the South and liberated their slaves. They all had to, legally and constitutionally, but then they ended up treating those same people that they had once enslaved either by oppressing them through various laws that we'll call the Jim Crow laws later on, and other kinds of nationalist laws that are passed throughout the South to restrict the movement and the ability of Southern blacks to rise up economically, or for them to receive education, or Southerners just ignored them. Now, it's that second thing, that ignoring blacks, that serves blacks best. So I want to give you a couple of statistics here, and I want you to think about what happens with the American black and with American black families in the 50 years or so after the Civil War. So just imagine, take one statistic. In 1865, there was probably about 5%, maybe as high as 10%, but probably closer to 5% literacy among blacks. That means among every 100 black persons that you met, only about 5, maybe 6 or 7 could read or write. That in a free market society, and also in a Protestant society, in a capitalist society, being able to read a contract is critical. Not just signing your name with an X, but being able to write out your name. And of course, the white population in the United States, especially the northern white population, was the most literate population in the world at that point, and had been for a very long time. So this is going to be a huge disadvantage, that American blacks are only at about 5% literacy. But by 1910, so only 45 years later, 45 years later, it's 2 generations, that's it. By 1910, the literacy rate among blacks is around 70%. Okay? Now think about that for a moment. What does that mean? Did whites come down and educate blacks? Not really. Did whites in the South educate blacks? Definitely not. Who educated blacks? Blacks educated blacks. In other words, that ignoring of blacks, no matter how evil or malicious it might have been, also was to the benefit of blacks. By being left alone, they were able to govern themselves, to learn to govern themselves, and to read and write on their own. I'll give you another statistic. Almost no black in 1865 was a property owner. How could they be? Right? They're enslaved. By 1910, again, that same year, by 1910, 1 out of every 4 blacks owned his own land in the South. Only 1 out of every 5 whites owned his own property. In other words, among blacks, there was greater property ownership than there was among whites. Who did that? All blacks. All blacks working together. All right, last statistic. Again, 1910. What do we think of when we think of the black family in 2020? We think of it being like almost every other family, with the, at least like white families, not quite like Asian or Latin American families. But when we think about the black family, we definitely think about divorce, and we think about children being raised without their parents. That's now about equal in the white community as well. But in 1910, 87% of all blacks lived in a 2-parent family situation. 87%. That is huge by any standard. In that same year, only 83% of whites lived in a 2-parent family situation. Blacks had a higher family stability rate than did whites. They had excellent literacy in 1910. They had an excellent family situation in 1910. And they had excellent property ownership in 1910. Now, would it have been great to be a black person in 1910 when it regards white laws? Of course not, right? Whites were oppressing blacks everywhere, and yet despite that, in spite of that, blacks did exceedingly well. In other words, freedom really, really matters. And imagine, and there's a kind of perversion. I mean, there's a huge perversion in the way that the laws were applied to blacks, but there's a kind of a compliment in a perverted kind of way. Because every time whites passed a law against blacks, they did so because blacks were succeeding and they're threatened. So they pass laws. And that means every time we can see a Jim Crow law being passed, as evil as they were, and they were utterly evil as those laws were, they were all signs that blacks were doing well. So I want you to get that into our understanding of American history. That freedom that came with the 13th and 14th Amendments, but that freedom earned by the 54th and 55th Massachusetts and then all the black regiments that followed. That freedom really meant something. Because we often think, because there were so many civil rights problems in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, and of course before that as well, if you think about the Tulsa riots in the 1920s, just horrific moments of racial abuse and racial tension in American history, we think it must have always been horrible. Well, yeah, it was always horrible, but there were moments of grand success that came out of that oppression. I'm not advocating for oppression, don't get me wrong, that's an evil. But that means that we can doubly congratulate Black Americans because not only did they do extremely well, but they did extremely well when really, by all the laws on the books, they shouldn't have done well at all. So please do keep this in mind. I think this is a really important way of understanding what's going on in America. And during that time that blacks were doing well, schools were completely segregated. There were laws that prohibited any kind of racial marriage, interracial marriage. Public accommodations such as hotels and restaurants were by law segregated, and of course public transportation was segregated. So all those things were working against blacks, and yet there was this ability on the part of blacks to increase their own position in terms of their economies, in terms of labor, property understandings, and especially in things like literacy, and to have that kind of stable marriage situation. So keep all of that in mind. That's pretty amazing. Okay, so I'm going to turn to a different topic now, since we're about halfway done through this class. We've got about 20-some minutes left. And I want to look at some of the documents that we have in the reader. So let me just assign to you for our next class, for Wednesday's class, I would like you to read for Wednesday. I would like you to read a couple of things. Number one, I would like you to read The Fallacy of Territorial Expansion by William Graham Sumner. I would like you to read The March of the Flag by Albert Beveridge, The Platform for the American Anti-Imperialist League, and especially The Eclipse of Liberalism by Godkin. So that's on pages 559, 565, 573, and 577. Please read all of those for Wednesday's class. For Friday's class, I would like you to read the final three readings of The Gilded Age, Pragmatism, The New Nationalism, and The New Freedom. But I'll remind you of that in our next class. So once again, for Wednesday's class, The Fallacy of Territorial Expansion by William Graham Sumner, The March of the Flag by Albert Beveridge, The Platform of the American Anti-Imperialist League, and The Eclipse of Liberalism. All right, so today I would like us to turn to one of the most important documents that we have, and we talked a little bit about it when we talked about progressivism. I want you to turn to page 547, in particular, Frederick Jackson Turner's very famous essay, The Frontier in American History. This essay was delivered on July 12th of 1893, and it was delivered at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago. The Columbian Exposition was a year late. It should have been in 1892. Instead, it came out because of a variety of ridiculous factors, mostly just kind of mechanistic factors, but factors in terms of trying to create that World's Fair. It was meant to be the Great World's Fair commemorating the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus arriving in the Americas, and therefore it was meant to be a celebration of progress. Now that, I mean, to many of us, Columbus Day now has become, Indigenous Peoples Day, and people mock Columbus as being worse than Hitler, but in 1890, 1892, 1893, that wasn't the case at all. Columbus was seen as this great purveyor, this great exponent of civilization, and there was a great celebration for him. So the Columbian Exposition, there's still places in Chicago. If you go to the Shedd Aquarium and those areas on the lakeside, those were all built during the Columbian Exposition. That whole area there along the lake was for the World's Fair. And during that World's Fair, they asked a 32-year-old historian, very young guy from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, Frederick Jackson Turner, to give a speech on the meaning of the frontier in American history. And it's a hot, humid Chicago afternoon, but he gives this speech. So if you turn to page 547, we see here this element. And this is where, if you guys remember when we talked about progressivism is a historical theory. It is not a political theory. And it's ironic that we now almost always identify progressivism with the left, because here we have someone like Jackson Turner, who is absolutely a kind of dyed-in-the-wool conservative. But when it comes to his historical understanding, he is deeply a progressive. And if you guys remember what we talked about with progressivism was based on the ideals of the German philosophers, the Prussian philosophers, Fichte and Hegel. And it's the idea that in all of history, you have the thesis, that is the present system, and you have the antithesis, that is the opposition to the present system. They clash one with another, the thesis into the antithesis, neither being powerful enough to be able to take control. They form a third thing, they form the synthesis, which then in history becomes the new thesis. And then it is challenged by yet a new antithesis. And it yet again becomes a third thing, a new synthesis, which then becomes yet again a new thesis. And this is progressive history. The idea that there was always a thing, an opposition to that thing, and then a third thing that forms when the opposition and the thing clash with one another, which becomes the new system. And that is the never-ending idea of progressivism, and it does end for certain people. For Karl Marx, it ends when capitalism has reached its final stage of exploitation, and we end up with a free labor system, not free labor like Lincoln thought of, but free labor in the sense that we all wake up every morning and we choose our profession for that day because the means of production are in our hands. But for most progressives, history comes to an end only when a certain theme has come about. So in 1992, there was a very famous Yale scholar by the name of Francis Fukuyama, who's still writing and very much with us, but he argued, and he was a conservative, he argued that with the fall of the Soviet Union, history was over, because his belief of history was that history was always a clash between democracy, which was the opposition, with totalitarianism, which was the system. And once democracy has ended the final totalitarianism, all we have left is kind of cleanup. Now, we know that that is not true. There was no end of history in 1982. It's a ridiculous idea. Even though Francis Fukuyama is an extremely learned, very excellent scholar, he's a progressive. He bought into this. President George Bush totally bought into this idea of progressivism. It's why we got into Iraq, the Second Iraq War. It's why we're still there, for the most part, in the Gulf, because of progressivism and this idea that democracy must liberate totalitarianism. And we chose that one part of the world to really focus our democratic efforts on. Karl Marx did believe that there was an end of history, as we said. It was the end when capitalism failed. Frederick Jackson Turner is also a progressive when it comes to history. And here is his idea of history. History is the clash of the European civilization against the Native American element, neither of which will be strong enough to conquer, and therefore it will become the third thing. It will become the American. The European clashing with the Indian, they hit, they become a third thing, they become the American. So he says here on page 547, in a recent bulletin of the superintendent of the census for 1890 appear these significant words. Up to and including 1880, the country had a frontier of settlement, but at present the unsettled area has been so broken into by isolated bodies of settlement that there can hardly be said to be a frontier line. In discussion of its extent, its westward movement, it cannot therefore any longer have a place in the census reports. And this is what he discovered, what Frederick Jackson Turner discovered when he looked at the 1890 census reports. If you look at the map of the United States, every year prior to that, 1880, 1870, 1860, 1850, every year you would have been able to have drawn a line somewhere between Plymouth Rock and Rodeo Drive. You would have been able to draw a frontier line that went from north to south but moved from east to west. And now in 1890, even though there are huge frontier pockets in places like Nevada and Montana and elsewhere, there are areas now in the country that are still frontier, but there's no frontier line. There's no specific line that we can point to like we could have even in 1880. It's over. And Jackson Turner worries that American history is now over. He says this brief official statement marks the closing of a great historic moment. Up to our own day, American history has been, in a large degree, the history of the colonization of the Great West. The existence of an area of free land, its continuous recession, and the advance of American settlement westward explain American development. Behind institutions, behind constitutional forms and modifications, lie the vital forces that call these organs into life. Now, think about how different that is from our Hillsdale understanding of history, where we look at Plymouth Rock, we look at the Mayflower Compact or the Plymouth Combination, we look at the Constitution, we look at the Declaration, the Bill of Rights, the Northwest Ordinance, and we have these moments of incredible, exaggerated development constitutionally, and that's how we tend to think of history, the Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian understanding. But Turner says, no, it's just the opposite. You have the frontier, and from the frontier come these certain institutions at Plymouth or Philadelphia or Santa Fe or Los Angeles. And therefore, all of history is dependent upon this frontier movement. So the founding fathers are just products of the frontier. The Civil War is a product of the frontier. All things are a product of the European clashing with the Indian, and blacks are there somewhere. But we have this European clashing with the Indian becoming the American. So behind these institutions, behind constitutional forms and modifications, lie the vital forces that call these organs into life and shape them into changing conditions. Now, the peculiarity of American institutions is the fact that they have been compelled to adapt themselves to the changes of an expanding people, to the changes involved in crossing a continent, in winning a wilderness, and in developing in each area of this progress out of the primitive and economic and political conditions of the frontier into the complexity of city life. Said Calhoun in 1817, "We are great and rapidly, I was about to say fearfully, growing." So saying, he touched the distinguishing feature of American life. All peoples show development. The germ theory of politics has been sufficiently emphasized. In the case of most nations, however, the development has occurred in a limited area. And if the nation has expanded, it has met other growing peoples whom it has conquered. But in the case of the United States, we have a different phenomenon. Limiting our attention to the Atlantic coast, we have the peculiar phenomenon of the evolution of institutions in a limited area, such as the rise of representative government. All right, so from Turner's perspective, government, representative government, arises only from frontier conditions. The progress from primitive industrial society without division of labor up to manufacturing civilization. The theory was that the Western farmers need technology like barbed wire or the plow or the windmill, and only the Eastern manufacturers can supply that. Thus, American development has exhibited not merely advance along a single line, but a return to primitive conditions on a continually advancing frontier line, and a new development for that area. American social development has been continually beginning over again on the frontier. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis, over and over and over again as we move from Plymouth Rock to Rodeo Drive. This perennial rebirth, this fluidity of American life, this expansion westward with its new opportunities, its continuous touch with the simplicity of primitive society, furnish the forces dominating the American character. The true point of view in the history of this nation is not the Atlantic coast, it is the Great West. Even the slavery struggle, which is made so exclusive an object of attention by writers like Professor von Holst, occupies its important place in American history because of its relation to westward expansion. In this advance, the frontier is the outer edge of the wave, the meeting point between savagery and civilization. Much has been written about the frontier from the point of view of border warfare and the chase, but as a field for the serious study of the economist and the historian, it has been neglected. So, from Turner's perspective, history has more or less ended now because we've reached the Pacific. Now, there are two major problems for this, as Turner understands it, for the American people. Number one, we have become so used to having resources at our disposal at all times that our American character has been shaped by plenitude. So this kind of cornucopia of wealth he now fears is over because we don't have new frontiers to exploit. That's problem number one for Turner. But problem number two for Turner is that we as Americans have defined ourselves by expansionism. And Turner is very worried that what was frontier expansion, this movement west, inevitably, inexorably towards the Pacific, will now be translated into an imperialist drive into Canada, into Mexico, into Hawaii, into all of these areas in the Pacific and elsewhere that the Americans had previously left alone for the most part because they were so focused on frontier expansion. So these two character traits Turner's not happy with. One, we exploit resources too much, and two, we could become imperialist. Now, most progressivism is imperialist. So Turner's odd here that as a historian and as a progressive, he is against empire. That is very odd. Almost every progressive is an imperialist, whether they will admit it or not. They kind of have to be when you think about the nature of history, always moving, always changing, always progressing from one thing to another. You have to always have a victim. It's another downside to the theory of progress. You can never have the common good. You can only have the greater good. Someone is always benefiting and someone is always losing in the progressive vision of history. But it also is expansionist, and it must be by its very nature. So again, let's continue here with Turner. What then is the frontier? It is not the European frontier, a fortified boundary line running through dense populations. The most significant thing about it is that it lies at the hither edge of free land. In the census report, it is treated as the margin of that settlement, which has a density of 2 or more persons per square mile. The term is an elastic one, and for our purposes does not need sharp definition. Why? Because it's this kind of poetic thing. that moves. We shall consider the whole frontier belt, including the Indian country and the outer margin of the settled area of the census reports. This paper will make no attempt to treat the subject exhaustively. Its aim is simply to call attention to the frontier as a fertile field for investigation and to suggest some of the problems which arise in connection with it. And I've just mentioned those two. One, exploitation of resources. Two, an imperialistic character. In the settlement of America, we have to observe how European life entered the continent and how America modified and developed that life and reacted on Europe. Our early history is the study of European germs developing in an American environment. Too exclusive attention has been paid by institutional students to the Germanic origins, common law, right? He's against that. Too little to the American factors. Now, the frontier is the line of most rapid and effective Americanization. The wilderness masters the colonist. It finds him European in dress, industries, tools, modes of travel, and thought. It takes him from the railway car and puts him in the birch canoe. It strips off the garments of civilization and arrays him in the hunting shirt and the moccasin. It puts him in the log cabin of the Cherokee and the Iroquois and runs an Indian palisade around him. Before long, he has gone to planting Indian corn and plowing with a sharp stick. He shouts the war cry and takes the scalp in orthodox fashion. In short, at the frontier, the environment is at first too strong for the man. He must accept the conditions which it furnishes or perish, and he fits himself into the Indian clearings and follows the Indian life. Little by little, he transforms the wilderness, but the outcome is not the old Europe, not simply the development of Germanic germs, any more than the first phenomenon was a case of reversion to the Germanic mark. Again, common law. The fact is that here is a new product that is American. At first, the frontier was the Atlantic coast. It was the frontier of Europe in a very real sense, but moving westward, the frontier became more and more American. As successive terminal moraines result from successive glaciations, so each frontier leaves its traces behind, and when it becomes a settled area, the region still partakes of the frontier characteristics. Thus, the advance of the frontier has meant a steady movement away from the influence of Europe, a steady growth of independence on American lines, and to study this advance, the men who grew up under these conditions and the political, economic, and social results of it is to study the really American part of our history, right? This kind of intense nationalism, but this focus on the American character, not as North and South, but as West. Westward expansion. And we see that with real figures like Daniel Boone, or mythical figures like Natty Bumppo in The Last of the Mohicans, or again, a real figure mythologized like Andrew Jackson. They all kind of represent this frontier type, this true American. Later, we'll have Buffalo Bill. In fact, amazingly enough, later meaning after Jackson, but amazingly enough, on July 12th in 1893, as you can see in the introduction on page 547, just right across the road at the same Columbian Exposition, Buffalo Bill is performing his Wild West show, and he and Turner are telling basically the same story. Okay, that's probably a really good place to stop, but I'd like to just sum this up quickly. What have we seen? We've seen the end of the American Civil War and this desire for a kind of Lincolnian peace, the River Queen doctrine, but instead we found an extreme oppression of blacks. But blacks, despite that oppression and to their eternal credit, did incredibly well despite being brutalized. But then we also see at this same time period this rise of kind of nationalistic thought, but also finally in American history and firmly now, the rise of progressive thought in history. We saw it earlier with Manifest Destiny. Now we're seeing it blatantly in the theories of Frederick Jackson Turner, even though Turner himself is a conservative and an anti-imperialist. Okay, everybody. Happy April 5th and 6th. I hope you guys all have a blessed Monday and Tuesday, and I will see you again on Wednesday. We'll record this lecture, that lecture at least, on Tuesday afternoon. Until then, God bless. Be good to one another. And just know I miss you guys. Take care.